There was a moment when Russell Wilson had everything: a Super Bowl champion, a franchise quarterback, a player once seen as the perfect leader for the Seattle Seahawks. And then came the contract, a deal so massive, so long, and so heavily invested in him that it was supposed to secure Seattle's future for years to come. A franchise quarterback locked in at his peak, a move that looked like stability, but instead, it became the beginning of the end, because what looked like a championship foundation slowly turned into one of the most debated collapses in modern NFL history. A deal that started as a reward eventually became a burden, and by the time Wilson left Seattle, the question wasn't whether the Seahawks made the right decision, it was whether they had already crossed a point of no return. And the most shocking part, the real collapse didn't even happen in Seattle. It happened after the biggest trade of his career. Because when the league saw Russell Wilson get paid, then struggle, then get moved, then struggle again, a much darker question started spreading across the NFL. Was this the worst long-term contract decision in football history? Or was Russell Wilson simply the first domino in a system that was already unstable? To understand how everything fell apart, you first have to understand how perfect the beginning looked. When Russell Wilson entered the NFL with the Seattle Seahawks, nobody expected him to become one of the league's defining quarterbacks. He wasn't the biggest, he wasn't the most hyped, and he wasn't even supposed to start immediately. But what made Wilson different was efficiency. He didn't need flashy numbers to win games. He didn't need perfect conditions. He operated within structure, made smart decisions, avoided mistakes, and most importantly, he delivered in critical moments. Then came the Super Bowl era. Seattle built a dominant roster around him, a legendary defense, a powerful run game, and a young quarterback who didn't need to carry everything, just execute when it mattered most. That formula worked perfectly, leading to a Super Bowl victory and establishing Wilson as one of the most reliable quarterbacks in football. At that point, the NFL narrative was simple. Russell Wilson was the model franchise quarterback, smart, efficient, clutch, durable, and seemingly built for long-term success. So when contract extension talks began, it felt like a formality. Seattle had their guy, Wilson had proven himself, and everything pointed toward a long-term partnership that would keep the Seahawks in contention for years. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, because success in the NFL changes expectations. Once a quarterback wins, he stops being just a player. He becomes the foundation of the entire organization. And foundations are expensive, very expensive. That's where the story begins to change, because the more Wilson succeeded, the more expensive he became, and the more pressure built around whether Seattle could sustain the roster around him. When the Seahawks finally committed to Russell Wilson's massive extension, it was seen as a necessary move. Franchise quarterbacks don't hit the market often, and when you find one, you pay him. That's the modern NFL reality. On paper, it made perfect sense. Wilson was the face of the franchise, the leader, the Super Bowl winner, the identity of the team. But what many didn't fully grasp at the time was what that contract would do to the rest of the roster. Because in the NFL, money doesn't just go to stars, it comes from somewhere else. Every dollar given to a quarterback is a dollar not given to depth, defense, offensive line protection, or supporting weapons. And slowly that balance began to shift in Seattle. Veterans left, defensive dominance declined. The once feared roster that carried Wilson early in his career started to thin out. Suddenly, Wilson wasn't just executing anymore. He was expected to elevate everything. And that's where pressure changes perception. When a team is stacked, a quarterback looks efficient. When a team weakens, that same quarterback is expected to carry games alone. And not every quarterback thrives under that shift. The Seahawks tried to adjust. They tried to rebuild around him. But the salary cap is unforgiving. Once a quarterback consumes a massive portion of the budget, roster construction becomes a constant balancing act, and eventually cracks began to show. What was once a championship formula started feeling unstable, and Seattle faced a difficult truth. They had paid their quarterback, but might have weakened everything else around him in the process. As seasons passed, the Seahawks remained competitive, but no longer dominant. Russell Wilson continued to produce strong numbers, make highlight plays, and keep the team relevant. But something felt different. The explosive dominance of earlier years was fading. The defense wasn't the same. The offensive line struggled. and Wilson began taking more hits, more pressure, and more responsibility than ever before. And in the NFL, that combination is dangerous, because when a quarterback is paid like a superstar, expectations rise instantly. Every loss becomes magnified. Every missed throw becomes a headline. Every playoff exit becomes a referendum on the contract itself. Wilson found himself in a difficult position. He was still playing well, but not well enough to silence criticism. And that's when the narrative shifted. People started questioning whether Seattle could still build a championship roster around him. Analysts debated whether his style could still carry a team to another Super Bowl. And for the first time, the idea of a separation didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. Because when a contract becomes too large relative to the roster, teams often reach a breaking point where they must choose: keep the quarterback and struggle to build around him, or reset completely. And Seattle eventually chose the second path. But the decision to move on from Wilson wouldn't just change the franchise, it would change the perception of his entire career. When the Seahawks traded Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos, the league was stunned. This wasn't just any quarterback. This was a Super Bowl champion, a decade-long franchise cornerstone, a player who once seemed untouchable. But Denver believed they were getting the missing piece, a quarterback away from contention, a veteran leader who could instantly elevate the franchise back into Super Bowl relevance. And at first, the optimism was real. The hype was massive. Expectations skyrocketed, and the NFL world believed Denver had just made one of the boldest moves in recent memory. But what followed became one of the most confusing chapters of Wilson's career. The offense struggled to find rhythm. Timing looked off. Chemistry wasn't there. And the dominance people expected never fully materialized. Instead of returning to elite form, Wilson's performance became inconsistent under a new system, and suddenly the narrative flipped again. Now people weren't just questioning Seattle's decision, they were questioning whether Wilson's best years were already behind him. The same player who once defined efficiency and clutch performance was now at the center of debates about decline, fit, and system dependency. And that's when the original contract discussion came back into focus. Because now analysts were asking a brutal question: did Seattle get out at the perfect time? Or did the system itself fail to support him properly? The story of Russell Wilson is no longer just about a contract or even a trade. It has become something bigger inside NFL history, a case study in how quickly a franchise can go from stability to uncertainty when expectations, salary, and performance stop aligning at the same time. Because when the Seattle Seahawks committed to Wilson long-term, they weren't just paying for past success. They were betting that his style of play, leadership, and clutch ability could remain elite even as the roster around him changed. That's the hidden pressure inside every massive quarterback deal in the NFL. The money isn't just for what the player already did, it's for what he must continue to do when everything else around him starts to shift. And that's where things slowly became complicated. As the salary cap tightened and veteran players left, Seattle's roster balance changed. The team that once supported Wilson with elite defense and strong structure gradually became more dependent on him to create magic in difficult situations. That shift matters more than people realize. Because when a quarterback is paid like a superstar, but the roster no longer looks like a Super Bowl roster, every mistake gets magnified and every loss feels like proof that something is broken. But the reality is more layered than the headlines ever showed. Wilson didn't suddenly become a different quarterback overnight. What changed was the environment. The margin for error disappeared. The defense was no longer dominant enough to control games. The offensive line struggled to consistently protect him. And the Seahawks found themselves in a position many NFL teams eventually face, paying top-tier money to one player while trying to rebuild everything else at the same time. That balancing act is where dynasties either survive or collapse, and Seattle eventually chose to reset. The trade to the Denver Broncos was supposed to be the next chapter in Wilson's legacy, a fresh start, a new system, a new opportunity to prove he could elevate a franchise in a completely different environment. But instead, it exposed another layer of the story, the reality that even great quarterbacks depend heavily on fit, timing, and organizational structure. Because in Denver, the expectations were immediate and massive. The team didn't trade for Wilson to rebuild slowly, they traded for him to win now. And when success didn't arrive instantly, the pressure shifted again. this time questioning not just the contract, but the player himself. That's what makes this story so misunderstood. It's easy to label it as a bad contract or a collapse, but that ignores how quickly the NFL landscape can change around a quarterback. One year a system looks perfect. A few roster changes later, the same system looks broken, and the quarterback, no matter how talented, often becomes the center of that blame. So when people ask whether Russell Wilson's deal was the beginning of a downfall, the deeper answer is more uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the contract, it was about how fragile success is in a league where everything depends on constant reinvention. Because the NFL doesn't reward stability for long, it rewards adaptation. And once Seattle's version of success stopped evolving fast enough, the entire structure started to shift. And that's why this story still matters today. Not because it defines Russell Wilson's career in one simple way, but because it shows how quickly a franchise quarterback can go from being the foundation of a dynasty to the most complicated decision a team ever makes.